Germans would be forced to recruit hundreds of thousands of women during the war. The only group of Soviet women actually left alone by the Germans, largely, was Soviet army nurses, who were usually spared due to their non-combatant status.
What became of the Soviet Union's most unlikely soldiers? The snipers, pilots, and machine gunners who vanished from the front lines. Their heroism was celebrated, but their ultimate fate was buried. Captured by the enemy, they entered a shadow world of brutality and silence. Why were their stories erased for decades? Let's explore the haunting mystery of what happened after the fighting stopped for the brave women that the world forgot. World War II often brings to mind men in uniform, but the Soviet experience was strikingly different. The Red Army sent women not just to hospitals and factories, but into battle itself, behind sniper scopes, in the cockpits of bombers, and at the triggers of machine guns as enemy tanks rolled forward. This was not an aside. It was national policy. The Soviet Union was the only major power to use women systematically in frontline combat. The scale was huge. Around 800,000 Soviet women served in the armed forces during the war, and more than 120,000 of them fought in direct combat roles. They flew planes, drove tanks, operated artillery, and picked off enemy soldiers from long distances. These women were trained, armed, and expected to hold ground alongside men. They were part of the fighting force, not extras in the background. Some became legends. The Night Witches were an all-female bomber regiment that flew lightweight biplanes on night raids. To avoid detection, they cut engines and glided silently to their targets. The Germans compared the sound to witches' broomsticks, and the name stuck. Then there were the snipers, professionals who turned patience and calm into deadly skill. Lyudmila Pavlichenko left university to become one of history's most successful snipers, credited with more than 300 confirmed kills. Stories like hers made headlines and inspired people back home. Yet the story has sharper edges. Fame did not guarantee safety when the front lines collapsed. Capture by the enemy brought a different kind of danger. Soviet policy viewed surrender as shameful, and many returning prisoners faced suspicion from their own government. Filtration centers interrogated survivors to decide whether they had cooperated with the enemy. Some were cleared, many were marked, denied opportunities, or sent to labor camps. Violence in captivity added another layer of stigma for women, who were too often blamed rather than cared for. That contrast, public praise in victory and private punishment in defeat, is part of why this chapter of the war remains little known. These women changed ideas about who could fight and how. They proved skill and resilience in extreme conditions, and yet too many paid for survival with stigma and silence. Remembering them reshapes the picture of World War II. It was a conflict in which bravery crossed gender lines, and sacrifice did not end with liberation, and must be remembered today. To understand how a Soviet woman soldier could be captured, we have to go back to the chaotic and terrifying beginning of the war. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched a massive surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history, and it caught the Red Army completely off guard. German forces advanced with shocking speed, slicing through Soviet defenses. They used their tanks to surround entire Soviet armies, trapping hundreds of thousands of soldiers in what became known as cauldrons. In these massive encirclements, chaos reigned. Units were cut off from command, supplies ran out, and ammunition was exhausted. For the soldiers trapped inside, the options were grim: fight to the death or surrender. In the first few months alone, millions of Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner. But for the women serving in those units, the situation was infinitely more dangerous. While surrender was a nightmare for any Soviet soldier, for a woman, it was almost certainly a death sentence. This wasn't just a random act of war, it was official policy. The German army had been directed by its high command to always shoot women who serve in the Red Army. It wasn't a battlefield decision, it was an order. The Nazi ideology saw women as life-givers and mothers confined to the home. The very idea of a woman picking up a rifle and fighting was to them a sign of a degenerate and barbaric system. They spat out vicious propaganda, calling these soldiers unwomanly and Russian witches. Their presence on the front lines was used to justify the Nazis' own twisted sense of racial and cultural superiority. Because of this, the moment of capture was the most perilous moment of all. While some women were taken prisoner to be interrogated or used for forced labor, many never made it to a camp. There are accounts of summary executions happening right on the spot. A woman revealing herself as a soldier or being discovered as one could be shot immediately by her captors. This makes the very fact of their capture a dark miracle. For a Soviet woman soldier to survive long enough to be registered as a prisoner of war was rare. It often meant they were wounded and unable to resist, or their captors, for a brief moment, ignored the order to shoot. But as we will see, surviving that first moment on the battlefield didn't mean safety. It only meant the nature of the danger was about to change, trading the quick horror of a bullet for the slow, grinding terror of the camp system. Grinding terror of the camp system. The road to captivity was littered with the bodies of those who never made it past the first step, setting the stage for the unimaginable brutality that awaited those who did. Let's begin with one harsh fact. From the moment they were captured, Soviet women soldiers lost the protection of international law. That single fact shaped everything that followed. The Nazis used a legal loophole as an excuse. The Soviet Union had not formally ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention governing prisoners of war. Germany had signed it, but German commanders decided that the rule didn't apply to Soviet captives. The result was not a minor technicality, it was an official policy that removed any obligation to care for or protect Soviet prisoners. No oversight, no Red Cross visits, no guaranteed food, shelter, or medical help. For many captives, this meant slow death by starvation, exposure, or untreated disease. Cruelty did not stop at neglect. From the invasion's start, the German High Command issued orders that explicitly targeted groups for execution. The Secret Commissar Order demanded that Soviet political officers, men charged with political education and morale, be separated from other prisoners and shot on sight. That instruction normalized screening prisoners for killing and made executions part of routine practice. The scope of who could be killed was wide and frightening. The Nazis defined intolerable elements in broad terms: Jews, committed communists, and the Soviet intelligentsia. Intelligentsia was deliberately vague, covering teachers, engineers, artists, professionals, or anyone who appeared educated or influential. That vagueness let soldiers and local commanders pick victims at will. For women soldiers, this danger had an extra edge. A woman who fought, who had training, or who showed independence was not merely an individual enemy. She was, in Nazi eyes, a living symbol of the Soviet system they wanted to destroy. Her education, her willingness to carry a weapon, and her presence on the battlefield marked her as especially dangerous. From the point of capture, she could be singled out, treated worse, or executed. Violence was another weapon used against captured women. Rape, assault were common in occupied territories and in some camps. In that environment, the lines between physical brutality and ideological punishment blurred. Violence was intended to humiliate, break resistance, and erase identity. For the survivors, such assaults added a layer of trauma that the lawless conditions of captivity made impossible to address. Surviving in those camps, therefore, required more than physical endurance. It required resisting a system designed to erase you. To stay alive meant to keep declining disease and hunger, to keep a sense of self under constant dehumanization, to quietly defy the labels the captors tried to fix on you. Every day of survival was an act of stubborn resistance against deliberate policies meant to destroy whole groups. That context also explains why, after liberation, returning women faced suspicion and punishment from their own government. Their survival had occurred inside a legal black hole created by both Nazi policy and wartime politics. When international law left Soviet prisoners unprotected, the women among them suffered a different, deeply personal kind of abuse. The problem was not only that they were soldiers, it was that they were women soldiers. Nazi beliefs had a strict, twisted idea of what a woman should be. In their world, women belonged at home, as mothers and homemakers. Their role was to raise children and keep the house for the Reich. Seeing Soviet women in uniforms, carrying rifles, flying planes, and leading troops was viewed as proof of Soviet barbarism and degeneracy. This was not just a matter of differing opinions. It became a reason to treat these women with extreme cruelty. The Nazis used hateful propaganda, calling them degenerate or Russian witches. Those names were turned into weapons. If you can call someone less than human, it becomes easier to hurt them. Hate words made it simpler for soldiers to justify torture and murder. The hatred showed up in systematic and brutal ways. Studies of this history show that women prisoners faced more than the same hunger and disease that men did. They were singled out for special kinds of violence, including routine torture, assault. Historians describe their suffering as physical, emotional, and often. This was not always the act of a few bad men. In many cases, the violence was part of how captivity worked, a tool used to humiliate, break, and destroy. The attack targeted every part of who they were. They were punished for being soldiers, for being Soviet, and especially for being women who refused to fit the Nazi image of womanhood. The goal of the violence was to crush their will and to prove that they were unwomanly and therefore less than human. For the guards, breaking these brave women became a perverse duty. By crushing those who challenged Nazi beliefs, they felt they were proving their own strength. This created a cruel trap with no way out. These women were persecuted twice over. On one hand, they lost the protections that should have applied to any prisoner of war. On the other hand, they were targeted because of their gender. Facing violence meant to erase the very qualities that had led them to fight. The mix of ideological hatred and deep-rooted misogyny made their experience in the camps uniquely horrifying. Male Soviet prisoners also suffered terrible horrors, but women faced this added, gendered layer of persecution that set their fate apart. For these women, the camps were not just places of hunger and sickness. Their bodies and spirits became battlefields. The violence they faced was meant to destroy not only their lives, but the very idea of a woman who stood and fought. Yet many still resisted in small ways, holding memories of home, sharing food, comforting one another, secretly teaching or hiding letters. Their quiet acts of courage mattered. Remembering their stories matters too. Recording what was done to them helps honor survivors and makes clear that this double persecution must never be forgotten. To survive as a Soviet prisoner of war, especially as a woman, was to fight a second, silent war every single day. This was not a battle with guns, but a struggle of will, a constant effort to stay alive and to keep a sense of self inside a system set up to break people down. The places where this fight took place had dry, bureaucratic names: gulags, the transit camps, and stalags, the main prisoner of war camps. Those names hide the truth. They were places where people slowly died. Life in the camps was shocking and harsh. Food, when it came, was a thin, watery soup made from rotten vegetables or grain husks. A small piece of black bread might be the only solid food for days. That bread was so precious that it was measured and split to stretch as long as possible. Starvation was not a random outcome. It was part of the plan. German officials said prisoners would be fed from seized grain, but much of that food was shipped back to Germany while prisoners were left to shrink away. Shelter was often a shaky wooden barrack with no heat, or a shallow pit dug into the ground with only a thin covering to keep out the wind. There were no proper latrines or clean water, and disease spread fast. A simple wound or a cough could become a death sentence because medical help was seldom available. The captors also tried to break prisoners from the inside. German officers set up internal hierarchies to divide and control people. Men from certain ethnic groups, Ukrainians, Georgians, or Cossacks, might get small favors, slightly better food, the job of watching other prisoners, or lighter work details. Those favors were meant to create jealousy and mistrust. The plan was to turn prisoners into rivals so they would not help or protect one another. For women, who were already singled out because of both their gender and their role as fighters, this fracturing made life even more dangerous. Whom could you trust? Was the man who offered kindness really a friend, or had he been bought with an extra crust of bread? Yet even in the worst conditions, the women resisted. Survival itself became a form of quiet rebellion. Each morning, a woman opened her eyes and rose. She had refused to be taken. Women developed practical and clever ways to survive. They formed fragile networks of mutual help, sharing scraps of food, hiding a blanket for a friend, or offering a place near a tiny fire. They cleaned wounds with rags, sewed torn clothes, and whispered warnings when guards were coming. Some who had useful skills, such as nursing, sewing, or a little German, used them to trade for small favors from guards or fellow prisoners, such as a cup of soup, an extra scrap of bread, or a safer work assignment. Resistance was not only physical, it was moral and cultural. Many held on to rituals and memories to protect their identity. Some quietly marked religious holidays even when it was risky. Others kept culture alive by whispering songs, reciting poems, or telling stories about home. A few wrote names on scraps of paper and hid them so the faces of the lost would not be forgotten. These acts kept a sense of self alive when everything around them tried to strip it away. By remembering their names, their families, and the reasons they had fought, they refused to be reduced to a number. Life in the camps offered no grand victories, only a chain of tiny, stubborn choices to survive another day. For many women, every small act of care, sharing a crust of bread, stitching a wound, reciting a line of a poem, was resistance. Those small acts made the difference between being erased and living to tell the story. For most prisoners of war, Liberation should have been the end of danger and the start of life again. After months or years of hunger, forced labor, and terror, being freed by Allied soldiers was supposed to be the moment they had been fighting to reach. For many Soviet women who came out of Nazi camps, however, freedom was only the start of something worse, a second betrayal by the country they had risked everything to defend. The root of this betrayal was a single, ruthless idea from the top of the Soviet state. Capture was unacceptable. The message from Stalin's government was blunt. For a Soviet soldier, there were only two possibilities: death or treason. Being taken prisoner was treated as a moral crime. That meant anyone who survived capture was suspected, not welcomed. When these women returned from German camps, they didn't go straight home. They were sent into a system called filtration. Run by the NKVD, the security police, filtration looked like the opposite of liberation. Instead of being greeted and cared for, former prisoners were interrogated and examined as though they might be traitors. One day, a woman had been a victim of the Nazis. The next day, she was on trial before her own government. Filtration had a single, terrible purpose: to prove whether a returning prisoner had collaborated with the enemy. Interrogators combed through every detail of captivity. They wanted to know how a person had been captured, whether they had resisted to the last, what they had said to German interrogators. Survivors who gave inconsistent answers, or answers deemed impossible, could be accused of collaboration. For women, the interrogations carried an extra, poisonous layer. Soviet officials assumed that being captured meant a woman must have suffered violence. In their twisted thinking, if a woman had been assaulted and had to cooperate in any way to survive, she was morally stained and therefore suspect. The state treated violence as a straightforward sign of guilt. Instead of sympathy for having been violated, these women faced blame and criticism. Their suffering was read as evidence of weakness or betrayal. The practical consequences were immediate and crushing. Some women were eventually cleared and allowed to return to their families and towns, but even those who walked free rarely came back to the same lives. Many had an entry placed in their internal passports, marking them as former prisoners. That bureaucratic stamp followed them everywhere. It blocked better jobs, cut them off from higher education, and shut them out of decent housing. The mark turned survival into a lifelong handicap. Worse still, large numbers of former prisoners were not simply stigmatized, they were punished. Hundreds of thousands were sent to the Gulag, the system of forced labor camps across Siberia and the far north. For these women, survival of Nazi camps did not lead to relief. It led to another form of imprisonment and hardship, often under conditions as brutal as those they had already known. Surviving one hell only to be shipped into another is a cruelty that defies easy explanation. Beyond punishment and paperwork, there was another kind of violence: erasure. The official story the Soviet state promoted after 1945 was a proud, heroic narrative of victory. It needed soldiers who were unbroken and whole, not people who had endured the messy, humiliating reality of capture and assault. Stories about captivity, particularly the experiences of women, didn't fit that image, so they were left out of public memory, ignored in histories, and silenced in public conversations. That enforced silence meant these women bore their trauma alone. They were told, implicitly or explicitly, to forget what had happened and to keep quiet. Speaking out could bring suspicion, shame, or punishment. Decades later, many survivors still carried scars that no official apology ever healed. The memory of abuse, the bitterness of betrayal by the very state they had risked their lives for, and the knowledge that history had chosen not to remember them. The injustice runs on several levels. These women had fought and suffered for their country. Then, once in the power of their own state, they were judged by rules that treated survival as a form of guilt. Violence, an act committed by the enemy, was recast as moral failing. Bureaucratic markings turned victims into second-class citizens, and mass sentences to the Gulag punished survival itself. Finally, their stories were erased from the official record, leaving a long shadow over personal and national memory. Telling this truth matters. It restores a more honest picture of what returning from war could mean, especially for a woman. Liberation did not automatically end suffering. For many Soviet women, it opened another chapter of fear, suspicion, and punishment. Remembering their experience corrects a historical blind spot. Bravery and loyalty cannot be measured only by whether someone died or survived. They should be judged by the courage shown while living and by what a society does for those it once called heroes.